Carter Hill lived in the last old cabin at the edge of High Ridge Estates. His home was small and simple, with wood that had faded from years of sun and rain. Tall trees stood around it, and behind the cabin, a narrow creek flowed gently through the land. The water was clear and cool, and it moved with a soft sound like a whisper through rocks and roots. For most of his life, Carter had watched that creek flow. He had seen it rise during spring storms and shrink in dry summers. It was not just part of the land. It was part of his life. He built a small wooden bench near the edge where he sat every morning with a cup of coffee. He watched birds fly low over the water and squirrels run across tree limbs. He had grown older with the land, and he knew its rhythms. The rest of the neighborhood was nothing like Carter's place beyond the trees. The land curved upward into rows of wide lawns and tall new houses. Each one looked almost the same. Big windows, fresh paint, perfect fences, people. Moved in with moving trucks and perfect smiles. They waved politely but never stopped to talk. Carter didn't mind. He had never needed much company. The Homeowners Association ran everything beyond his trees. It was called High Ridge Estates HOA, and it had rules for everything from grass height to mailbox color. Meetings were held in a fancy clubhouse near the front gate. Carter rarely went. He had been there once years ago when they first built the place. A board member had told him the creek was lovely but might need to be cleaned up someday. Carter had nodded but said nothing over time. New board members came and went, but the rules kept growing. The new HOA president was a woman named Judith Lorne. She had a sharp voice and a clipboard. She walked the neighborhood, often pointing at fences or flower beds while writing notes. She wanted the entire community to match, to look polished, clean, and modern. Judith did not like the creek behind Carter's cabin. She said it looked wild and untidy. She called it unused land, and once even referred to it as wasted space. From her office window near the top of the hill, she could see the curve of the creek cutting behind Carter's trees like a wrinkle in an otherwise perfect sheet. Carter heard the talk but said nothing. He knew the creek had always been there, even before the houses, even before the roads. When the rain came, it carried water from the hill down through the roots and rocks and past his cabin, where it flowed into a small marsh that kept everything dry. The water never stayed long enough to cause trouble because it had a place to go. But the board did not see it that way. To them, it was just a ditch, something they could change, something that did not fit their plan. And so they stopped sending letters and started making decisions without saying much to anyone, including Carter. Then one morning he woke to the sound of engines outside his window. Machines were pushing through the trees and workers were laying out ropes and flags. A large cement truck rumbled down the gravel path behind his cabin. Carter stood on his porch, holding his coffee, watching as the workers began to pour heavy gray concrete straight into the creek bed. The sound of the water was gone, covered by the grinding of machines and the sharp calls of men moving fast. Carter did not shout. He did not run out. He just stood there watching the creek disappear beneath the weight of something that did not belong, and in that quiet moment, he knew something important had just changed. Weeks before the machines arrived at Carter's cabin, a small meeting was held in the HOA clubhouse. It was not listed on the neighborhood calendar, and no signs were posted outside the building, just a few quiet messages sent between board members and a quick mention during the end of a gardening newsletter. Most homeowners never noticed it, and Carter never received a word inside. The clubhouse Judith Lorne stood at the head of a long table holding a folder thick with papers. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her clipboard rested neatly beside her. She smiled at the other board members as they arrived, offering bottled water and carefully folded agendas. Only 4 members showed up, not enough for a full vote by the book, but enough to say it counted. She began the meeting with small talk about holiday decorations and the new tennis court lights. Then she flipped open the folder and pointed to a map of the neighborhood. A red marker line ran along the edge of Carter's property, tracing the path of the creek. She called it a drainage concern, said it attracted insects and made the lower end of the property look less refined. She claimed several neighbors had complained about the smell. Though no names were mentioned, she said the area could be improved with a decorative path, something clean and flat made of natural stone that would look beautiful and raise property values. No one questioned where the complaints had come from. No. One asked if the creek served a purpose. They simply nodded. One man said it was a great idea. Another asked if it could be done before the spring open house. Judith smiled and said yes. Her cousin ran a landscaping company and he could offer a very good rate if they acted quickly. A motion was made and passed without delay. There was no discussion of environmental review, no engineers, no notice to the rest of the community. The papers were signed that night and the project was set to begin within 2 weeks. The board members finished their drinks and left the clubhouse without thinking twice. Judith was pleased everything was moving faster than she had hoped. The only property that might cause trouble was Carter's cabin, but he had never attended meetings and rarely spoke up. She believed he would grumble for a few days and then forget all about it, just like old trees forget the wind. Once the storm has passed, she sent her cousin the final approval and told him to start work as soon as the ground was dry enough to hold the trucks. He promised to have the entire project finished in less than 10 days. They would pour concrete into the creek bed, lay decorative stone across the top, and shape a walking path along the rear fence line. No more messy water, no more wild grass, just a clean line behind clean homes. 2 days before the machines arrived, Judith walked to the edge of the property to look at the creek. One last time. The trees were tall and the air was cool. She could hear birds in the branches and the sound of running water below. She frowned. The place smelled like dirt and moss and wet leaves. She shook her head and turned back toward the sidewalk, writing a note in her folder about adding lights along the new path. Carter saw her from his porch but said nothing. He watched her step around fallen twigs and pull her jacket tight as she passed through the trees. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who wanted to fix something without understanding what. Itwash could feel it in his chest, a pressure building not from anger but from something heavier. A quiet fear that something important was about to be erased, not with force, but with permission and papers and polite smiles. When the trucks rolled, Carter was ready, but the damage had already begun. Carter walked down the gravel path with slow, steady steps, his boots pressed into soft earth, still damp from morning dew behind him. The machines were rumbling again, pouring concrete into the creek bed. The sound echoed through the trees like something heavy falling over and over. He held a folder under one arm and wore the same worn jacket he always wore in the colder months. She reached the temporary fence the workers had set up and waited a moment until someone noticed him. One of the younger men looked nervous and motioned toward a woman standing near a white pickup. She was on the phone, but lowered it quickly when she saw Carter approaching. She introduced herself as the project manager, said they had all the approvals and everything was moving according to plan. Carter nodded slowly, then asked if she knew what that creek was for. She smiled and said it was mostly decorative and that the new path would be a big improvement. Carter looked past her toward the pile of rocks and bags of cement. He pointed down the hill and told her the creek was not just for show. It was part of the land. It had always been there, carrying water from the top of the ridge all the way to the marsh on the other side. When it rained, it kept the slope dry. When the snow melted, it kept the ground from turning to mud. Without it, the entire lower side of the neighborhood would hold water like a bowl. The project manager seemed confused. She said the HOA had not mentioned anything about drainage. She checked a paper on her clipboard and said everything had been reviewed and signed off. She offered to give Carter the number for the HOA office if he had more questions. Carter said nothing more. He just turned and walked back up the path through. The trees passed the same roots and stones he had walked by for 40 years. He went inside his cabin and sat at his desk, the folder still under his arm. Inside were old survey maps, hand-drawn by the original developer, showing how the creek ran through the hill and how it connected to the drainage system installed decades ago. He had kept them just in case, and now he knew why. The next morning, Carter took the folder straight to the HOA office. The building was bright and quiet with large glass, doors, and polished floors. The receptionist looked surprised to see him, and even more surprised when he asked to speak with the board. After a short wait, Judith came out of a meeting room, her expression calm but slightly tight. She greeted Carter. With a smile that did not reach her eyes, he handed her the folder and told her plainly that filling the creek would cause water to back up in the lower part of the neighborhood. He explained what the map showed and how the land had been shaped. To use the creek as a natural drainage path, Judith flipped through the pages quickly, then closed the folder and said they appreciated his concern, but the board had made a decision and the work was already underway. She assured him that modern landscaping could handle water just as well as old creeks and that everything would look much better when it was done. She thanked him for stopping by and said she hoped he would enjoy the new path once it was finished. Carter watched her walk back into the meeting room. He stood for a moment, then turned and left without another word. The folder remained on the front desk untouched by the time he got back to his cabin. The sound of the creek was almost gone, replaced by the grinding of machines and the hard clatter of stone being set into wet concrete. And though the sky was clear, Carter could already feel the storm that was coming. Not in the wind, not in the clouds, but deep in the ground beneath their feet. The sky darkened slowly over High Ridge, estates clouds rolling in like a heavy gray blanket. The air was thick and still as Carter stood on his porch sipping coffee. The wind whispered softly through the trees behind his cabin. Birds fell silent, and the creek bed, now filled with concrete, was quiet. No water flowed, only the faint scent of damp earth lingered. That afternoon, the first drops began to fall small. At first, then heavier. The rain tapped against windows and splashed on leaves. The neighborhood seemed calm, but Carter watched, closely knowing what was coming. The creek was gone, and the water had nowhere to go. By evening, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. Streams of water ran down the streets, rushing along gutters, but behind the cabins, the land was soft and wet. The concrete that replaced the creek cracked slightly as water pooled along its edges. The stone path was slick and muddy patches formed nearby. Neighbors called each other, worried about their yards and driveways. Some saw puddles forming in places that had never held water. Before one woman left her porch and wrapped a tarp over her flower beds, another man piled sandbags around the base of his garage door. Carter walked slowly through the neighborhood, a damp chill in the air. He noticed the lawns that had once been dry were now soaked, the soil squished underfoot. Some driveways had small puddles in cracks and low spots. The street drains struggled to keep up, but water found other paths. The water moved into yards and crept near foundations. At the lower end of the hill where the old creek had once carried rainwater away, several homes began to show signs of trouble. One family discovered water leaking under their front door. A child called out from inside that the carpet was wet. The family moved furniture away and placed towels to soak up the water. The sound of running pumps filled the quiet air. Carter stopped to talk to a few neighbors who admitted they had noticed changes, but did not connect it to the concrete path the news had not spread, and the HOA had sent only a short email, reminding residents to check their sump pumps and report flooding if it got worse. That night the rain fell harder. The sound against the roof was constant and steady. The ground beneath High Ridge, estates grew heavy with water. The creek had once been a natural escape, but now the concrete held it back and the earth began to soak slowly like a sponge. Carter sat by his window looking out over the neighborhood. The streetlights blurred in the rain. He could see shadows moving through the mist. The new path behind his cabin glistened, but there was no life in it. No running water, no birds, no sound, just a hard line cutting through the trees. He felt the weight of what had been lost. The creek had been small but powerful, the hidden thread keeping the neighborhood safe from storms. The one thing that carried the rain away before it could become a problem. Now that thread was broken, and the water was waiting to test the land. The days after the storm brought little relief. The rain slowed, but the ground beneath High Ridge Estates was soaked beyond repair water. No longer flowed quietly down the hill. Instead, it settled into low spots and yards, turning grass into mud and puddles into ponds. Carter walked the neighborhood and saw how much had changed. Lawns that were once green and well-kept now looked like small lakes, water stretched from fence to fence, reflecting gray skies and broken branches. The air smelled of wet earth and grass drowned under water. Some homeowners tried to save their gardens, covering plants with plastic sheets, but even those efforts seemed small against the growing flood. Driveways cracked under the weight of soggy ground. Cars struggled to pass over mud and standing water. One family left their home and moved into a hotel, while contractors came with pumps and fans trying to dry out their basement. The sound of machines and running water became common as neighbors worked to stop the damage. Carter visited the home of a young couple a few doors down. They had lived in the neighborhood for only 2 years. Their yard was now a swamp. Their children could no longer play outside without boots and raincoats. The wife thanked Carter quietly for warning the board, but said no one had listened. At neighborhood gatherings, conversations turned to concern and confusion. No one understood how a small creek could cause so much trouble, but as the days passed, the story began to spread. Slowly, neighbors shared what they knew, and Carter patiently explained how the creek had been the natural path for rainwater to flow safely away from their homes. The HOA sent letters promising to investigate and find solutions, but no clear answers. The board members held meetings behind closed doors and hired experts to assess the damage, but the water kept rising. The once tidy neighborhood was now dotted with puddles and soggy patches. The streets were lined with sandbags and plastic barriers. Carter stood on his porch one evening watching a family struggle to move their boat from the garage to the flooded driveway. It was an image no one expected to see in a place known for manicured lawns and quiet streets. The creek was gone, but the water it once carried had returned, and it was not gentle. The community that had prided itself on order and beauty was facing a new challenge. One no one had planned, for the natural world had pushed back against the changes, and the price was clear. The small creek was gone, but its memory lived in every pool and puddle that soaked the land. Carter knew this was only the beginning. He watched the clouds and listened to the soft sounds of dripping water and distant pumps. The land was tired and wet, but so was the neighborhood, and they would have to find a way through it together. As the water lingered in yards and streets, a small group of neighbors began asking questions. They wanted to know why the neighborhood was flooding, why the water had nowhere to go, and what could be done to fix it. Carter quietly joined them, bringing the old maps and notes he had kept for years. They gathered in one of the homes on the higher part of the hill, a place with dry floors and a warm kitchen table. The group spread out papers showing survey maps, emails from the HOA, and pictures taken before and after the creek was filled. They talked for hours, piecing together a story of rushed decisions and missing information. One neighbor found minutes from a board meeting showing a vote to fill the creek. The meeting had taken place in secret without notice to most residents. There was no public discussion and no chance to raise concerns. The vote passed quickly, and the project began almost immediately. No environmental checks were done, and no experts were called in before the work started. The neighbors reached out to local officials and environmental groups. Some brought engineers who studied the site and confirmed what Carter had said: the creek was an important natural drainage path. It was not just a decoration. It carried water safely during heavy rain and kept the soil stable. Without it, water had nowhere to go, and damage would continue until the creek was restored or an equal system put in place. News of the findings spread slowly through the community. Many homeowners were shocked to learn how little information the board had shared and how fast the project had moved without proper review. Some felt betrayed, others were angry, but most were worried about what came next. The HOA board responded with statements about ongoing investigations and promises to work with experts, but their words did little to calm fears. Neighbors began to organize more, meetings to share information and plan. Next steps. Carter found himself speaking, often reminding people that the creek was the heart of their land and that fixing the problem would take patience and care. Insurance companies were contacted by homeowners whose properties had suffered damage, but many claims were denied, citing that the flooding was caused by landscaping changes outside their coverage. Some families faced large repair bills and growing frustration. Through it all, the swamp continued to grow slowly, creeping further into yards and streets. Each rainstorm made things worse, and the hope that the neighborhood would quickly recover began to fade. The creek that once carried life had been covered by concrete and stone, and in its place lay a growing problem that could not be ignored. Carter sat at his desk one evening, looking over the old maps and new photos. He knew the fight was just beginning, but he also believed the neighborhood could heal if they listened to the land and worked together to bring back what had been lost. Months passed since the creek was filled with concrete, and the water problems only grew worse. The small pools that had formed in backyards turned into large puddles that refused to dry. The soggy ground softened even more, and lawns that once looked perfect now remained wet and muddy. No matter the weather, mosquitoes multiplied quickly in the standing water. Their quiet buzzing filled the warm summer evenings. Neighbors complained about the smell of damp earth and the heavy air that seemed to hang over the lower part of the neighborhood. Even the trees looked tired. Some branches drooped closer to the ground as if weighed down by the moisture. Cracks began to appear in driveways, sidewalks, and even house foundations. The ground shifted unpredictably as water pushed against the soil beneath the surface. Some homeowners noticed doors that stuck in their frames and windows that no longer closed properly. The small creek that had kept the land stable was gone, replaced by hard concrete that cracked and crumbled under pressure. Real estate agents stopped calling to show the neighborhood to potential buyers. The signs of water damage made homes harder to sell. Property values began to fall slowly but steadily. Families who had planned to stay long-term began talking quietly about moving. Some worried the neighborhood would never return to the way it was. At neighborhood meetings, the new board tried to reassure residents that they were exploring options and working with experts, but no easy solutions had appeared. Neighbors grew restless and frustrated. The swamp behind their homes seemed to grow bigger with every rainstorm. Children could no longer play freely in backyards. Puddles and mud made outdoor games. Difficult parents worried about safety and the risk of illness from mosquitoes and standing water. Some families bought pumps and hoses to try to drain their yards, but the water always returned stronger and faster. Carter spent more time walking the neighborhood, checking on friends and neighbors, offering advice and support where he could. He reminded them that the land needed time to heal, but he also understood the worry in their voices and the weight of the problem on their shoulders. He often sat by the cracked stone path where the creek once flowed, listening to the silence, where water had once whispered through rocks and trees. The concrete was broken in places, weeds grew tall, and birds no longer came to drink. Even the new plants that had been planted along the path struggled to survive. The ground was too wet, and roots drowned in the soft mud. The vision of a clean, modern neighborhood was fading, replaced by a reminder that nature would not be so easily tamed. Yet despite the frustration, Carter believed there was hope. The water was still moving, just slower and in different ways, and if the community worked together, they could find a way to bring the creek back or build something as strong and life-giving as it had been. The neighborhood had been built on land shaped by water and stone, and the lesson was clear. No matter how much concrete they poured, the earth would find a way to remind them of its power. The neighborhood was quiet in the early morning light. The air smelled fresh. After a night of gentle rain, Carter stood at the edge of the cracked stone path where the creek had once flowed. His eyes rested on the patches of green, pushing up through the broken concrete, small wildflowers and grasses reaching for sunlight. After months of standing water and soggy lawns, neighbors had finally come together. They formed a group dedicated to restoring the natural flow of water through the neighborhood. Working alongside local experts, they began planning how to bring back the creek or create a system that could handle the rains without flooding homes. Meetings were held in homes and at the community center. Conversations filled with ideas and hope replaced the earlier frustration and worry. Everyone understood the challenge was big, but so was their commitment to the place they called home. Carter often spoke quietly, reminding people of the land's rhythms and the importance of patience. Slowly, the HOA board shifted its approach, moving from quick fixes to long-term solutions. They approved plans for removing sections of concrete and creating natural drainage channels that would let water flow safely. Again, the process would take time, but it was a step toward healing the neighborhood and restoring balance. Contractors began carefully breaking up the concrete-filled creek bed, planting native grasses and shrubs to help the soil absorb water. The sound of machines was softer now, more thoughtful, more in tune with the land than before. Children watched curiously. As the work went on and some helped plant seeds along the new paths, neighbors shared stories about the creek and the land before the houses were built, stories passed down from older residents and families new to the area. These stories helped remind everyone that the land was alive and needed respect and care, not control and concrete. One afternoon, after a spring rain, Carter walked down the new path now lined with small streams and fresh plants. He listened to the gentle rush of water returning. To its home, the birds had come back and the air smelled sweet with the promise of growth and renewal. The neighborhood was far from perfect. The scars of the past still showed in cracked sidewalks and damp yards, but there was a new energy, a sense of shared responsibility and a deeper connection to the land that no rules or meetings could ever create. Carter smiled softly. Knowing the creek was more than just water moving through the neighborhood, it was a reminder of what happens when people listen to the earth and to each other when they choose to work together instead of apart. The days ahead would bring challenges, but also hope. The swamp was fading and life was returning one careful step at a time. The quiet creek that had once been filled with concrete was now flowing again, and with it the promise of a better future for everyone in High Ridge Estates.